I'm Shae Russell for mining.com.au, and it is that time of week again when we drag data Dan away from his spreadsheets and whack him in front of a camera. Thanks for putting the headset on today, Dan. How are you, mate?
I'm very, very well, thank you, Shae. Very well.
Thrilled to have you on because we are going to tackle a rather personal topic today. So, everybody, that is not a little ears warning, by the way, but this is Trump, the media, and the noise that is coming out of the White House and is a distraction for investors. Because, Dan, I don't even know how to finish that statement. Where are we going? What's the problem here?
The problem is it's a focus on headline, not fundamentals, and that's really what we're starting to see. That there is that decoupling when like Mr. Trump and those in those inner circle of leadership, for example, they're focused on. They seem to be focused very much on culture wars, but the fundamentals are they've got a debt ceiling, and even the likes of Doge and all these things we're talking about, they're kind of doing cost savings, which are so minimal. I mean, the merits of these programs are debatable, but the fact of the matter is this: is that the whole world seems to be distracted with, what will they do next? Now, that's a terrible thing for markets because it creates uncertainty. But what it also does, though, is we're starting not to look at the reform questions around the economy. We're looking at personality, and of course, you've got the new Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, who's called a snap election to really effectively use the Trump bogeyman as a way to get votes, and it's clearly tightened up polls in that part of the world. But if we were to look at what's really going on, particularly for the industry we work in, is that we need to talk about, there's still a need to talk about, what's going on with gold in terms of, its flight to safety model. We still need to talk about critical minerals, how they're going to be in the next evolution of the economy, and we need to get back to talking about the economy and reform. And again, we've just also had here in Australia a budget which I think, on merit, the Treasurer probably didn't want to do, but kind of had to do because of the election. So the fact of the matter is this: is that at the moment we need to start talking about proper micro and macro economic reform to really start driving outcomes from a government perspective, but also to start getting back to this idea of what do markets want? Where's the next 12 to 18 months going to go? Where's the next 5 years looking like for resources investment? And currently, so much of our news flow has been dominated by really personality, and there is a fatigue setting in. And I can certainly say that is from my part of the world, that fatigue of kind of talking about personality as opposed to fundamentals is certainly it's exhausting, and it is draining after a while.
It certainly is, and thank you in that answer because you've touched on three things I really do want to go into today, and we'll get to them. But before we do, uh, look, we know that Trump and anything that's coming out of his mouth is hogging airtime in the headlines. Are these masthead and publishers who regurgitate these words? Is it their fault? Can we blame them?
I think I think honestly, like having been in that environment, there's two things, like some of the major metros are basically dedicated to reporting everything. And but what they give up though is talking about the local story and the local angle. And when that story is ignored, like people become disengaged as well. So like when you kind of focus on what's going on overseas at the exclusion of what's going on locally, yeah, there is certainly I think the question, it could seem loaded, but it's very true. I mean, if you look at metro mastheads and the way they cover news these days, it's very much international macro focused. It's not actually locally focused. And again, whether to draw a correlation between publishing performance and uh, that strategy, that might reveal something. But by and large, yeah, there's certainly some case of this obsession of one individual or a handful of individuals has certainly been a negative. And I think, yes, there's probably some media outlets could probably dial it back a bit and start focusing on news which people are also incredibly interested in, as opposed to the ramblings of one US president.
Well, let's take this to the fundamentals that are being ignored while these headlines suck all the oxygen out of markets, essentially. What are some of the good fundamentals or the positive fundamentals for mining that are happening in the background that we might be missing because of these noisy headlines?
Well, we've got a very good story on aluminium. And now I know that's been overshadowed by the tariff conversation. What people are missing is that in the 12 months to January, that's a $14 billion trade export story from Australia. Then so the likes of bauxite and again, this is aluminium ores we're talking here. And within that group of aluminium, it's been such a fantastic story. Now that story is also predicated on the fact that dwelling units, the way houses are being constructed, they're taking on different materials. The evolution of design in this very space is incredibly, it's a really hot story to be telling. And, like, well, we've put some time into it, in our patch. The fact of the matter is, this is probably a little bit more to go in terms of, well, what are they going to come up with next? Now, that came as a result of a price signal because traditional steel, sand, rock, those things have become very, very expensive. This kind of this ability to form material is one thing you can do with aluminium, and it tends to be from extraction much closer to the surface, so its cost, its upstream cost is a lot lower than, for example, the likes of iron ore, which go offshore and get processed and that type of thing. So there's a very good story there. Additionally, like Australians are starting to clue onto the story that the renewable energy piece, which has been championed by Chris Bowen, the energy minister here in Australia, that's come under scrutiny, and probably rightfully so. So for coal miners and people saying coal's terrible, well, they're starting to look quite closely at this, going, well, what exactly are we talking about? Because it's been the headline dominating at the expense of the detail. And that's kind of where we're tending to find now that as people become more engaged in what drives these particular issues, that there's a very good story there. And like we talk again about the coking coal, which we're very dominant in this part of the world. There's a very good story about that industry if we choose to tell it. So the ability to kind of start putting a lens on economic policies, which some are working well, some are working not so well. We can now really start to drill into that. We've got that benefit of doing that. So yes, and of course there's gold, which is doing very well, and then copper's the other one because of its thermal properties, for want of a better description. I still think, looking at lithium and the critical battery story, that's a point in time, and so cars are cars, and the amount of copper and what they're using and fuel consumption and the critical minerals and the rare earths. Uh, Cars are not evolving, if you know what I mean. There's still a very, very good story to tell there. I just think, if anything, we should be more informed about what the nuance of what machines and how they're being built is happening.
I liked your comment before about economic reform. Now, we've seen the Labor government put out a pre election budget, which was kind of nothing. It was a drink of warm water. It was a glass of warm water. It wasn't that exciting. Where are the strong leaders in Australia? Where are they coming from, and where are they putting out good ideas for economic reform? Because I'm going to be honest, I didn't see anything in the pre election budget.
No, and you won't get much from the opposition either. It's this kind of, the only thing the budget really highlighted is the fact that we've got a structural deficit. So basically, our outgoings continue to exceed our incomings. Um, the government of the day is still heavily reliant on income tax as the base. That provides so much of like, I think it's $300 billion is what is the government relies on, to fund its programs. Now that's a problem because people, the way people work is changing. Uh, and so, and the other thing too is, and then the bracket creep story. Now, as unsexy as that sounds, the fact of the matter is more Australians are moving into higher brackets of pay, and as a result, they end up paying a lot more tax. And as a result of that, like, while it sounds great, it's not a very competitive place to be when you're not keeping as much as what you earn. And again, the stories around consumption taxes and GST, whilst that's ignored, you will have a situation where you've got policy and economic malaise. And so, where the leaders coming from? They're coming in the minor parties, I suppose. And I think that's probably, but those ones that can plot a pragmatic course of being able to argue the case for economic reform, I think we'll actually find a lot of popularity within the Australian electorate. And the reason for that is because so many people in this country are engaged. I mean, it's very easy to put a camera in front of a young person and say, "What do you think of the budget?" They go, I don't care." Well, anyone over the age of 30 is typically tuned in, and they want to know where the taxpayer dollars going. So that's going to be interesting to see. The performance of minor parties. I mean, the Teals, for example, that were here in Australia. They're big on climate change and on shut down resources, and to a large degree, and have really kind of been hostile towards that sector. The fact of the matter is this: is that they'll have to stump up ideas beyond ideology. And in the case of resources and the resource sector, you know, if you look at the budget bottom line in corporate tax, you know, close to 2/3 of the tax paid by businesses in Australia comes from resources. That's the business tax component I'm talking about, not the income tax. Yeah, and it doesn't employ that many people. But the point being is that it's a huge revenue driver, and not one person has been able to articulate any type of reform to replace those critical industries. And here's the thing: they won't, because this is a sector which must stay. Because for all the ambition around you know, kumbayas and holding hands and all this type of thing. It's only made possible really by the fact that you've got a very strong, well-performing export sector, and for Australia, that's particularly in the case of resources and indeed part and agriculture. And those stories again are tied into what Asia and Southern Asia, where the trade relationship is for this country, moving away again from the US narrative, because yes, there might be cultural similarity, but the reality is our economic focus has to be on how does Australia drive the very best outcomes for its people. I'd say currently at the moment they've got a reform deficit that is the ability to kind of champion what they need to be doing. Currently, they're not.
I really appreciate your insights there. And there's some excellent points that you've made. And once again, we're not going to have time to go into all of them, but I do want to close out on this. Obviously, we're mere weeks away from, even though an election hasn't been called, we know we've got to vote in a few weeks. So obviously, our politicians are going to go into campaign mode. Specifically, when it comes to the resource sector and mining, what do you want to see our politicians talking about?
To forget the doomsday scenario, Australia's got a world-class resources sector, and that's really what should be spoken about. Um, we've allowed a decade, I think, in this country where it's become that coal's a dirty word. It shouldn't be. Australia provides, more than half the world's metallurgical coking coal and some of the finest, best quality thermal energy coal. That has a very strong role to play in the decades to come. Yeah, the second and third points being that uh, resources jobs are high quality jobs that are very difficult to replace in terms of for a country, but it's not that difficult to go and extract the same minerals from another part of the world. Australia's policy settings around resources need to be stable. Currently, they've been one area within the taxation environment, the regulatory environment, which have been demonised. And so, what I really like to see is this case of valuing this critical industry, because without it, um, Australia becomes a rump of a country. So it's basically articulating a future with certainty for the sector, which has become so critical, and something which all Australians should be very, very proud of how we conduct resources in this country. It is a benchmark, and sadly, it's been politicised to such a point that it's been a case of how can we extort more money through new taxes and levies out of resources. That has to stop for no other reason that you know you don't want to kill the goose that lays the golden eggs, and that's really what we need: policy certainty. That would be the key thematic I would say that politicians probably need to be focused on. I do think, for example, the industrial relations environment for Labor, particularly in Western Australia, may yet provide a bit of a problem for them in that part of the world. Although Western Australia is a very strong Labor state these days, so that remains to be seen. But the framework at the moment needs to be about celebrating industry which delivers so much. That's the key takeout.
I lied, it turns out, based on what your answer was. I do have one more question for you, and this is election related. Is there a chance that our politicians have taken advantage of the resource sector? Like they've ignored it for so long because it just hums along in the background. Have they ignored the sector for too long and essentially just taken advantage of it?
They've definitely taken advantage of. There's no question about that. I mean, uh, if you were to look at the Queensland case, the royalties imposed upon that state by that state government, and whilst there's noises from the current administration to change it, what they effectively did was they basically took a mallet, if you'd like, to a trading relationship with the Japanese, which has been the bedrock of this state's prosperity. This I'm talking Queensland here, and destroyed it. 40%. Coal royalties is the highest part of it. That was all that does is it just sucks out any intention to invest. And the thing is, it's a dreadful way of conducting a state budget if your only way is to say, well, we've spent too much money, we better go find a way to extract more royalties from the resources sector because they've done it efficiently and well. So we'll basically fill up our coffers with their profits, which again, profits and losses also happen in boom and bust times. And the record coal prices that were observed in COVID have since gone, and that was a very brief window. But those companies, are not they don't invest in the areas because the government's taken the dividend. So that's kind of so like do they do, and they also, for example, the governments are far too adversarial. It's a case of they're our resources. How dare you do it again? But someone has to take the risk to extract those resources. Like there's not this kind of case where you turn up with a ute and say, right, I'm going to dig for some gold today. There's a whole series of regulation companies have to go through, and that's basically, like you can't anyone can call themselves a gold miner, right? But unless you actually go, but if you're a listed gold miner, you have to go through a whole series of, you have to provide a JORC and all these things to kind of um, ensure that you're delivering the gold, as they say. So my bottom line, the short answer is yes, and that culturally needs to be rethought.
I love that the short answer is yes, but I loved the long answer better. Listen, Dan, unfortunately, I have run over time today, but it was well worth it as far as I'm concerned. Look, thank you so much for being here today, and I cannot wait to speak next week when there's more data in.
All right, cheers, Shae.